The following presentation discusses the issues and influence of gender on custody battle decisions. The statistics of fatherless children and motherless children are alarming. According to the National Fatherhood Initiative, children raised in a fatherless home are 7 times more likely to become victims of teenage pregnancy, more likely to abuse substances, and the rate of high school dropouts nearly double, just to name a few. The harmful impacts go both ways. Most child victims are abused by a parent. In substantiated child abuse cases, 78% of children were victimized by a parent, according to the National Children's Alliance Society. There are clearly dangers on both ends of the spectrum. When it comes to determining the custody of a child, the key is to exhaust all necessary efforts to ensure every child winds up in a safe and loving home. Due to sex and gender biases, this is not always the case. This presentation highlights the consequences of gender bias within the custody battles of divorced parents over their children, including issues revolving around the stereotype that women are the primary caregivers or domestic violence tendencies for fathers and how that impacts custody rights. There's also the impact that patriarchal, legal, and economic contexts have on the ability for women to gain a bargaining position in situations where custody is subject to negotiation, as well as the role of men to be apart from home and children in the workforce. I'm advocating for a more devoted system that better recognizes the biases described in this presentation. The effort to implement a more fastidious civil court system is crucial for the positive development of children. These statistics show the importance of a parental figure in a child's life. In some cases, the consequences of having a single parent far outweigh the consequences of being raised by both parents, especially when one is negligent or abusive. However, in the event that both parents are fully capable and prepared for separately sharing the responsibility of a child, a compromise over custody must be made. A compromise that is founded strictly upon the capabilities of parents rather than the preconceived expectations that they are assigned as a father or a mother. The first bias displays a hypothetical divorce scenario in which participants were asked to make subjective judgments on who deserved custody. The participants favored mothers in custody decisions unless the mother failed at a parenting task. However, performance did not affect custody decisions for fathers, suggesting that negative performance violates the stereotyped expectations for mothers. In addition, there is an implied notion that men are not acclimated enough to be considered for failure. There's clearly a two-sided set of values that clearly expect women to serve in one way and men to serve in another. This is seen in practice as the Florida State University Law Review voices that Florida not only denies the capability and desire of many men to participate actively and meaningfully in the care of their children, but also perpetuates the subjugation of women as mothers by deeming them weak and incapable of survival without the support of a man. A California Western Law Review speculates that American courts began shifting from a paternal to a maternal presumption in the early 19th century during the Industrial Revolution because it forced fathers to seek employment away from home. As men spent less time at home, mothers were forced to assume a large role in childbearing. Relating back to civil custody cases, judges will often review the levels of parental involvement by asking teachers, school administrators, doctors, and others which parent showed up more frequently. Because mothers are statistically more likely to be pinpointed as the more active parent, this may be a major deciding factor. Over time, a separate spheres ideology developed. Accordingly, men and women were placed in their appropriate spheres. Men naturally belong in the market because they're competitive and aggressive, and women belong in the home because of their natural focus on relationships, children, and an ethic of care. These clear gender roles accumulated through masculine and feminine qualities appointed by society. Additionally, because women had no right to property and were effectively banned from the economic sphere, women could not possibly support their children, and consequently, fathers were automatically awarded custody during this time. While a separate spheres ideology had some adverse effects on women, a new focus on the nurturing nature of mothers ultimately resulted in the tender years doctrine. This doctrine automatically granted custody of young children, usually the age of 7 or under, to the mother unless she was deemed unfit. Faced with such gender-based presumptions limited to their contact following divorce, many fathers lost touch with their children. In spite of its consequences for the father and the child relationship, nearly all states adopted this doctrine in one form or another, making it the accepted norm in custody determinations for the following century. This brought us to a more contemporary issue seen with fathers. However, research speculates that these issues are not as prominent as the stereotype makes them out to be. Many men argue that family courts send the message that fathers are not essential to raising children. They argue that the courts consider them nothing more than weekend visitors, and that so few fathers take an active role in parenting after divorce due to the blatant bias they experience during the divorce process and the determination of child custody. Some fathers, those among the 27% who have no contact with their children post-divorce, may even argue that gender bias during divorce litigation is the reason they no longer engage in parenting or any form of relationship with their children. Before blaming gender bias on a father's post-divorce status, we must first take into consideration how child custody is decided in the majority of divorce cases. What do the statistics say about how custody is decided during divorce and whether or not there is a true gender bias? According to DivorcePeers.com, the majority of child custody cases are not decided by the courts. In 51% of custody cases, both parents agreed on their own that the mom should become the custodial parent. In 29% of custody cases, the decision was made without any third-party involvement. In 11% of custody cases, the decision for mom to have custody was made during mediation, and in only 5% of custody cases, the issue was resolved after a custody evaluation, and only 4% of custody cases went to trial. In other words, 91% of child custody after divorce is decided with no interference from the family court system. Maybe the bias towards mothers is a false claim when fewer than 4% of custody decisions are made from the family court. In an excerpt from Phyllis Chesler's book, Mothers on Trial, more and more mothers have realized that battered women risk losing custody if they seek child support or attempt to limit visitation. Incredibly, mothers also lose risk custody if they accuse fathers of physically or sexually abusing them or their children, even or especially if these allegations are supported by experts. This is because an ideal father is expected to legally acknowledge and economically support his children. So fathers who do anything more for their children are often seen as better than mothers.
Divorce has grown into a custom in American society and around the world in recent decades. There are few instances in which individuals have not experienced the repercussions of a broken marriage in one shape or another, either personally or through the tribulations of their peers. A couple's decision to divorce, however, is merely one of the many vital considerations they face at the end of a marriage. Arguably, one of the most important of their decisions is fighting over who will have the right to custody over the children.
I left this slide blank because it is not for me to say what should or should not be done. No parent is perfect, and each case is unique in its own way, factoring in manipulatory factors and status to obtain custody. What I can suggest is meta-awareness and articulating how and why those choices are or might be effective or ineffective within a given context. Judges and other authoritative figures must note these patterns and highlight their importance so as not to overlook them in any respect. As we conclude this course, I challenge you to think about your own development and relationships with your parents, as well as the child-parent relationships around you. Are the impacts of misinformed custody decisions worth mentioning in a gender studies course? Feel free to discuss this in the response section.